This mansion was not a dream. It was a mistake no one had the courage to admit. The problem was never building a house of that size. The problem was believing it could protect the people who ruled the world. What rose on that hilltop was not merely a residence. It was an attempt to escape the noise, the crowds, the scrutiny, the resentment growing below. And every time someone tried to call it a refuge, they ignored the most uncomfortable fact of all. Fortresses also attract sieges. Nothing there was designed to welcome. Everything was designed to control. The sweeping view was not contemplation, it was surveillance. The walls were not aesthetic, they were distance, and every decision embedded in those walls carried a silent assumption. If power were large enough, the world would stay outside. But the world never agrees to stay outside for long. While the house was taking shape, something else was growing alongside it. Not concrete, not stone, not manicured garden. It was anger, a diffuse anger, spread across entire cities, fueled by exhausting workdays, crushed wages, and the feeling that the game was decided before it even began. The mistake was believing that anger wouldn't pass through gates. What few realized is that this mansion was not built simply to live in. It was built to disappear, to make invisible those who were already too visible, to turn power into silence, and silence into safety. But silence, when imposed, becomes provocation. The house functioned like a closed world, a self-sufficient organism. Energy, food, circulation, art, everything resolved internally. Nothing depended on the city. Nothing needed to be seen. Nothing needed to be explained. That was the true luxury, not wealth, but the ability not to answer. The problem is that this kind of isolation carries a cost that never appears on balance sheets. It creates a moral bubble, a place where decisions lose immediate consequence, where numbers have no faces, where criticism arrives muffled, distorted, filtered through layers of advisors and physical distance. For a while, it feels like it works. But it only worked as long as the world accepted the rules, and the world stopped accepting them. Outside, names began to turn into symbols, not of success, but of excess, not of progress, but of imbalance. Signs appeared, speeches changed tone. What was once admiration became accusation, and suddenly, that house on the hill no longer felt unreachable. It felt provocative. There is a detail rarely mentioned. The more isolated the house became, the more exposed it was. Not physically, symbolically. It became a mental shortcut, a fixed point where everything without a clear address could be concentrated. Every frustration needed a face. Every inequality needed a setting. The mansion offered both. And then came the paradox. The more power existed within those walls, the less real control there was over what they represented. The house began to tell its own story, independent of whoever was inside. A story about separation, about withdrawal, about a hilltop occupied while the ground below sank. But no one inside wanted to hear that, because hearing it would mean admitting the project was wrong from the start. That isolation was not protection, it was abandonment. That stepping away does not neutralize conflict, it only delays them, and delayed conflicts charge interest. The cruelest detail is that everything there was built to last generations. Every architectural decision carried the idea of permanence, of legacy, of continuity. But legacies don't survive on material solidity alone. They depend on desire, and desire is not automatically inherited. The house was ready for the future. The future simply wasn't willing to live in it. Without realizing it, that monumental construction began serving the opposite function of what was intended. Instead of uniting the family around a symbol, it began to weigh on them. Instead of representing victory, it demanded justification. Instead of being a home, it became an argument against. And when a house becomes an argument, no one sleeps well. The question hovering, still unspoken out loud, was simple and devastating. If this place was built to protect power, why did it start to feel like a prison? But before anyone could answer, another, more uncomfortable question imposed itself. Silent, inevitable. Who really paid for this house? And I ask you now, who would keep paying, even after no one lived there? The question lingered, unanswered, like a draft moving through empty corridors. Distance was never an accident here. It was the strategy. The hill was chosen carefully, not too close, not too visible, close enough to command, far enough to avoid contact. From above, the world looked manageable, reduced to roads, rooftops, patterns. People became movement, noise became abstraction, and abstraction is where uncomfortable realities go to disappear. Inside the house, decisions felt clean, efficient, rational. There were no crowds, no strikes, no faces attached to consequence, just ledgers, projections, advisors. Problems arrived already filtered, already softened. That distance created a dangerous illusion. That power could be exercised without friction. But power without friction doesn't become gentler. It becomes careless. Outside the gates, the country was changing shape. Cities were swelling. Factories multiplied. Workdays stretched longer, while margins grew thinner. The gap between those who decided and those who endured widened quietly, year after year. And while this house perfected isolation, the idea of isolation itself began to feel offensive. People noticed who could afford silence. The irony is that the house was never meant to be cruel. It was meant to be controlled, predictable, safe. Every system inside it was designed to eliminate uncertainty. Art stored underground, paths carefully choreographed, views calibrated. Even leisure was structured. Spontaneity was inefficient. Exposure was risky. This was power trying to become permanent. But permanence demands something power rarely invests in: legitimacy. The public didn't hate the house because it was beautiful or expensive. They hated it because it felt like a withdrawal, like a declaration that the rules no longer applied equally. While others were trapped in systems they couldn't escape, the people inside this one had simply stepped above it all. And that perception spread faster than any statement could correct. Protests didn't need detail. They needed symbols. And symbols don't defend themselves. The house became shorthand for something larger. Monopolies that felt untouchable. Wealth that seemed immune to consequence. Decisions made far away by people who would never feel the fallout. What made it worse was the silence. No speeches came from the hill. No explanation. No apology. Silence was interpreted as arrogant. Distance as contempt. Even neutrality became suspicious. The absence of response allowed others to write the narrative instead. And they did. Newspapers sharpened their tone. Cartoonists exaggerated the silhouette of wealth perched above suffering. Politicians learned that invoking the name associated with that house could rally crowds instantly. The mansion stopped being a residence. It became a talking point, a weapon, a target. Inside, the systems still worked. Meals arrived. Gardens stayed pristine. Art remained untouched. But something fundamental had shifted. The house was now absorbing pressure it was never designed to withstand. Symbolic pressure. You can fortify stone against storm. You can't fortify it against meaning. The family felt it, even if they didn't name it. Visits became shorter. Public appearances more calculated. Security tighter. Each adjustment reinforced the very image they were trying to escape. The house demanded distance, and distance fed resentment, and resentment demanded more distance. A closed loop. What began as insulation turned into isolation. And isolation has a strange effect on legacy. It freezes it, locks it in place, prevents adaptation. The next generation, watching from inside, didn't see a refuge. They saw a liability, a structure that required constant defense, constant explanation, constant negotiation with a world that no longer admired. They inherited not comfort, but tension. The house asked a question every day it stood there. Was it still worth it? Not financially, symbolically. Was the protection it offered greater than the hostility it generated? Was silence still safer than engagement? No one answered out loud. But behavior changed. Stays grew infrequent. The idea of home loosened. The house remained, but presence thinned, and absence spoke louder than any declaration ever could. Because when power stops inhabiting its own symbols, those symbols begin to rot. Not physically, conceptually. The public noticed that too. The house that once signaled dominance now suggested retreat. The fortress on the hill looked less like command and more like avoidance. And avoidance, in the face of scrutiny, reads like guilt, whether it exists or not. That was the moment the equation flipped. The house no longer protected the family's image. It endangered it. What was once built to outlast criticism now amplified it. Every empty room echoed with question. Every closed gate looked like confirmation. The cost of maintaining distance rose higher than the cost of facing the world directly. And quietly, without announcement, the most powerful admission occurred. The house was no longer lived in the way it was meant to be. It still stood, but it had lost its function. Which raises the next uncomfortable question. If a house built to protect power becomes unusable to those who own it, what does that say about the power itself? The realization settled in slowly, but once it did, it couldn't be undone. A house like this does not age quietly. It waits. It waits for the moment when inheritance stops feeling like privilege and starts feeling like obligation. Because inheriting a fortress is not the same as inheriting a home. A home adapts to its occupant. A fortress demands that its occupants adapt to it. The next generation felt that weight immediately. They did not grow up building this place. They did not choose its distance, its symbolism, its posture toward the world. Yet all of it arrived attached to their name, their reputation, their future. They were expected to defend decisions they never made, to justify a structure designed for a different era, a different kind of power. And unlike money, a structure like this cannot be quietly diversified away. Every visit carried expectations. Every absence triggered speculation. If they stayed too long, critics saw indifference. If they stayed away, critics saw abandonment. The house trapped them in a narrative they could not control. It asked them to perform a role written decades earlier, under conditions that no longer existed. This is the hidden cost of legacy architecture. It freezes intent in stone. The world outside was accelerating. Media cycles shortened. Public opinion shifted faster than institutions could respond. Wealth itself was changing form, becoming less visible, more mobile, less tied to place. Power was learning to move lightly. This house could not. Its meaning was fixed, its presence unavoidable. It could not reinvent itself without acknowledging what it had been. And that acknowledgement was precisely what no one wanted to provoke. Because to reopen the story was to invite judgment, so the default response became avoidance. The house remained maintained, staffed, preserved, but it was no longer lived in with conviction. Visits became ceremonial, carefully timed, carefully managed. No spontaneity, no sense of belonging. The building felt less like shelter and more like a stage that demanded performance, and no one wanted to perform anymore. Inside, the silence deepened. Rooms designed for gathering sat unused. Objects collected to impress a specific world lost their audience. Even the art, once a statement of cultural authority, began to feel detached from daily life. Beauty, without context, becomes weight. Meanwhile, the public interpretation hardened. People noticed patterns before they noticed explanation. They noticed that the house existed, but life had moved elsewhere. They noticed that the symbol endured while engagement did not. And in that gap, assumptions flourished. If they don't live there, people wondered, what was it really for? That question carried teeth. Because a structure built as a declaration of permanence looks different when its owners treat it as temporary. It starts to resemble a monument to miscalculation, proof that even the most powerful plans can outlive their usefulness. The family understood this instinctively. They felt the tension every time the house came up in conversation. It was never neutral. It was never just a place. Seat. It was always loaded, always political, always symbolic. And symbols are dangerous when they stop serving those who created them. The irony is that walking away did not reduce the house's power over their image. It increased it. Absence amplified speculation. Silence invited interpretation. The house, untouched by daily life, became easier to project onto. It was no longer a residence. It was a question mark, and the question was never flattering. Was this retreat? Was this guilt? Was this indifference? Or was it an unspoken admission that the model no longer worked? Each observer chose the version that fit their worldview. The family could not correct all of them. They couldn't even agree internally on what the house now represented. That uncertainty is corrosive, because once a legacy becomes ambiguous, it stops being an asset. It becomes a risk. something to manage rather than celebrate, something that requires lawyers, committees, foundations, explanations, and that is when the transformation begins. Slowly, cautiously, the idea emerged that the house might need a new role, not because of finance, the family could afford maintenance, but because meaning was leaking out. A symbol without function decays, even if the stone remains perfect. Opening it, repurposing it, recontextualizing it, these ideas felt radical at first, almost like surrender. But the alternative was worse, to let the house stand as an unanswered accusation. The question shifted from, why did we build this, to something far more unsettling. What happens if we keep pretending it still works? Because pretending requires energy, constant, invisible energy, and the next generation had other battles to fight, other images to manage, other futures to design. They were not interested in defending a fortress designed for a war that had already ended. That was the moment the house crossed a threshold. It stopped being private, not officially, not yet, but psychologically. The separation had begun. The idea that this place might belong more to history than to its owners crept in quietly, like a draft through sealed windows. And once that idea takes hold, it doesn't leave. Which leads to the next tension. If the house no longer functions as a home and cannot disappear, what does power do with a symbol it can no longer inhabit? The idea lingered, uncomfortable but persistent, that the house no longer belonged to the present. At first, no one called it a problem. That word would have implied urgency. Instead, it was treated like an inconvenience, something to be managed quietly, handled by schedules, committees, and careful language. But the truth was harsher. The house had begun to work against the very power it was meant to protect. Because a home only functions as long as it feels inhabited. Once that feeling disappears, the structure doesn't become neutral. It becomes exposed. The mansion still demanded everything it always had: staff, maintenance, security, coordination, silence. But it no longer gave anything back emotionally. It did not offer rest. It did not offer belonging. It did not offer privacy in the way privacy once mattered. Every visit felt symbolic, not personal. Every night spent there felt recorded, interpreted, evaluated. A home should reduce friction. This one created it. The family began to realize that the house was no longer shielding them from public scrutiny. It was concentrating it. Every article that mentioned wealth circled back to it. Every conversation about inequality seemed to find its silhouette. The mansion had become a visual shorthand for excess, whether that was fair or not. And fairness stopped mattering once symbolism took over. Power, in earlier generations, had benefited from being visible. Visibility signaled authority. It reassured allies and intimidated critics. But the rules had changed. Visibility now invited challenge, scrutiny, reinterpretation. The house was optimized for an older logic of dominance, one that assumed distance would always command respect. Now, distance triggered suspicion. The longer the mansion stood under that interpretation, the more difficult it became to justify keeping it private. Because privacy implies exclusion, and exclusion, in a climate shaped by resentment, reads as provocation. That is when the quiet discussions began. Not dramatic arguments, not public debates, just questions raised in closed rooms. What purpose does this place serve now? What risk does it carry? What happens if nothing changes? These questions didn't demand immediate answers, but they altered behavior. They changed how often people came, how long they stayed, how attached they felt. The house was still magnificent, but magnificent had stopped being useful. There was another problem, more subtle but more damaging. The mansion froze the family in a specific historical posture. It anchored them to a narrative of control, isolation, and hierarchy at a time when power was learning to speak a different language. Mobility, discretion, flexibility, influence without spectacle. The house could not do subtle. Every stone screamed permanent. Every gate announced separation. Every terrace reinforced the idea of being above rather than among. And that posture required constant defense. It demanded explanation, historical framing, moral positioning. all exhausting, all unnecessary for people who no longer needed to prove anything through buildings. So the house became a question of efficiency, not financial efficiency, symbolic efficiency. Was it efficient to carry a symbol that attracted hostility? Was it efficient to maintain a place that limited strategic options? Was it efficient to inherit a structure that could not adapt without losing its identity? The answer, increasingly, was no. And once that conclusion settled in, the transformation was inevitable. Reframing the house became less about generosity and more about risk mitigation. Opening it was no longer a gesture of goodwill, it was a recalibration, a way to drain the symbol of its sharpest edges, to convert accusation into artifact, to move the house out of the present tense and lock it safely into the past. History is safer than relevant. By allowing the public inside, the family could change the relationship. Curiosity replaces anger. Distance becomes education. Control shifts from secrecy to narrative. The house stops being a fortress and becomes an exhibit, no longer something to fight, something to walk through. That shift did not happen overnight. It required legal structures, foundations, agreements, language carefully stripped of emotion. The family did not frame it as retreat. They framed it as stewardship, preservation, cultural responsibility. But beneath the phrasing was a simple truth. The house could no longer function as a private asset without generating public cost. Opening it diffused pressure. Visitors came not to protest, but to observe. The house became contextualized. Its excess explained rather than imagined. Anger softened into analysis, critique into commentary. The symbol lost its immediacy, and with that, the family regained something they hadn't realized they'd lost: freedom of movement. No longer tethered to the mansion as a living statement, they could step away without interpretation. Absence stopped meaning avoidance. It simply meant distance. The house stood, but it no longer stood for them in the same way. The irony is sharp. The most powerful house they ever built only became manageable once it stopped being theirs in the most important sense. Once it belonged to history, not identity. Once it no longer demanded residence, only maintenance. That is the hidden lesson of monumental power. Structures outlast strategy. And when strategies change, structures must either transform or become liabilities. The mansion transformed, but in doing so, it revealed something unsettling. If the ultimate solution to a symbol of power is to turn it into a museum, what does that say about the durability of power itself? Once the house slipped into history, something else quietly collapsed with it. For a long time, the mansion had functioned like armor, heavy, imposing, unquestioned. Even when it became inconvenient, it still felt protective, as if its sheer mass could absorb criticism by standing there, unmoved. But the moment the doors opened regularly, that illusion ended, because armor only works when it stays closed. The first visitors didn't arrive with anger. They arrived with curiosity. They walked slowly, listened carefully, looked closely. They asked questions that no protest ever needed to ask out loud. How many people did it take to keep this running? How far removed was daily life here from the rest of the country? How deliberate was the separation? Those questions didn't accuse. They dissected, and dissection is far more dangerous to myths than outrage. Inside the mansion, nothing changed physically. The stone didn't flinch. The corridors didn't shrink. The art didn't lose its value, but the psychological balance shifted. The house was no longer speaking from above. It was being examined from within. Power hates proximity. Once people could stand in the rooms, the distance that had once inspired awe collapsed. The scale remained impressive, but it was now measurable. The excess was no longer imagined. It was contextualized, and context is how symbols lose their sharpest edge. But something else happened, something the family hadn't fully anticipated. By turning the mansion into an object of interpretation, they surrendered control over meaning. Visitors didn't leave with a single conclusion. Some admired the discipline. Others felt discomfort. Some focused on the art, others on the isolation, others on the system that made it all possible. The house stopped delivering a clear message, and that ambiguity spread outward. The mansion no longer defended wealth as competence or inevitability. It exposed wealth as a choice, structured, insulated, engineered. That realization didn't provoke riot. It did something subtler. It normalized skepticism. When power becomes explainable, it becomes challengeable. The family felt the difference almost immediately. The house stopped absorbing criticism on their behalf. It stopped acting as a buffer. Instead, it redirected attention back to systems, decisions, and structures that still existed elsewhere. The fortress had been neutralized, but not in the way fortresses usually fall. No siege, no fire, just relevance draining away. The mansion became a closed chapter, not an ongoing threat. And paradoxically, that made the family more vulnerable in other arenas. Without the house serving as lightning rod, scrutiny redistributed itself. Attention moved to institutions, influence, networks, things far less tangible and far harder to manage. The house had been a decoy, a massive one, and now it was gone. That realization triggered an uncomfortable reassessment. The mansion had not just been protection from the public, it had been protection from reflection. As long as it stood as an unquestioned monument, it distracted from deeper questions about power's role, limits, and consequences. Once it became a museum, those questions resurfaced. What remains of power when its symbols are archived? What authority survives when its strongest image becomes historical rather than lived? The mansion offered no answer. It simply stood there, perfectly maintained, silently accusing no one and defending no one. Visitors left with impressions, not instructions, and impressions, multiplied enough times, quietly reshape narrative. The family adapted, as powerful families always do. They learned to operate without that symbol, to move lighter, to decentralize presence, to exist without a single place carrying their weight. In that sense, the loss of the mansion as armor made them more modern, but something was irreversibly lost. A sense of inevitability. The house once implied permanence, that some structures were too large to fail, too solid to question, too embedded to disappear. Its conversion into a public site shattered that implication. It proved that even the most carefully constructed manifestations of power could be repurposed, reframed, and effectively disarmed. No destruction required. That lesson didn't stay confined to the Hill. It spread quietly, absorbed by a culture already suspicious of concentration and insulation. The mansion became an example cited without anger, referenced without fear, a reminder that withdrawal is not neutrality and isolation is not safety. And perhaps the most unsettling truth emerged only after years of distance. The house had not saved power from change, it had delayed it. And delay, when mistaken for victory, compounds consequences. Because time does not pause for stone. The mansion still stands. Visitors still come. Photos still get taken. But its role has shifted completely. It no longer projects strength. It archives. It no longer commands attention. It contextualizes it. And power, stripped of its symbols, must now operate without spectacle, which raises the final unresolved tension. If even the most powerful house in America could not preserve authority forever, what does that imply about the structures of power still pretending they can? Once the mansion stopped acting as armor, power had to learn how to move without walls. At first, nothing dramatic happened. There was no announcement, no ceremony marking the end of an era. Power rarely leaves with noise. It slips out quietly, adjusting routes, changing habits, dissolving ties that once felt permanent. The house stayed behind. That distinction matters, because when power leaves a building but the building remains, the separation becomes visible. The structure keeps its shape, but the force that once animated it is gone. What remains is outline without pressure, form without function. And people notice that. The mansion, now open and explained, began to feel strangely lighter. Not physically, but narratively. It no longer carried the burden of the present. It was framed, dated, contextualized, a product of a specific mindset, a specific moment, a specific belief about how power should exist in the world. That framing was disarming. It told visitors implicitly that this was no longer how things worked, or at least no longer how they worked here. The house became evidence of an old operating, impressive but obsolete. Meanwhile, power adapted elsewhere. It fragmented, spread, became quieter and more agile, less attached to geography, less interested in permanence. Influence learned to travel without announcing itself, to function through networks rather than monuments. The age of the single, dominant symbol was ending. The mansion had simply been the first to admit it. What made this transition unsettling was not loss, but exposure. Once power detached from its most visible shelter, it had to confront a reality it had long avoided. Without symbols, authority must justify itself continuously. It cannot rely on awe or intimidation. It must perform, and performance is risky, because performance invites evaluation. The house had once absorbed that risk by standing there, mute and imposing. It took up space so that explanations didn't have to. Once it became historical, that buffer vanished. Power could no longer point to stone and say, "Look." Now it had to say, "Trust." That is a harder request. Visitors walking through the mansion began to sense something else as well. Not resentment, not admiration, but distance. The house felt disconnected from the present in a way that was almost calming. It reassured people that this form of dominance had already peaked, that whatever anxieties they carried about inequality and control were no longer concentrated here. The mansion was finished. That realization subtly altered the emotional economy around it. No anger, no urgency, just analysis. And analysis drains fear faster than confrontation ever could. Ironically, by stepping away, power preserved itself more effectively than by clinging on. The family no longer had to defend the house, and by not defending it, they stopped reinforcing its symbolism. The mansion became background, an artifact rather than an actor. But artifacts still teach. They teach by contrast. Walking through the corridors, people could sense how carefully separation had been engineered, how intentional the insulation was, how much effort had gone into creating a world without interruption. That effort itself became the lesson. This level of withdrawal was not accidental. It was strategic, and strategies always leave fingerprints. The house showed how power once imagined safety, height, distance, silence, self-sufficiency. It revealed a belief that control could be maintained by stepping above the system rather than engaging with it. That belief worked until it didn't. What failed was not wealth. What failed was insulation. The modern world punishes insulation. It rewards responsiveness, adaptability, narrative agility. The mansion was none of those things. It could not pivot. It could not apologize. It could not evolve without losing its essence. So, power moved on. And in doing so, it confirmed something deeply uncomfortable. The most expensive structures are often the least flexible. They lock power into a posture that eventually becomes indefensible. What was once strength calcifies into exposure. The mansion did not fall. It froze, and frozen symbols are safe to examine. As years passed, fewer people connected the house directly to living authority. It became associated with history books, tours, school trips. Its name evoked a chapter, not an ongoing presence. That was the final transformation. Power had exited the frame. What remained was a warning disguised as preservation. Because if this house, built with unimaginable resources, engineered for permanence, designed to outlast generations, could not adapt fast enough to remain relevant, what hope do newer structures have when the rules change again? That question lingers quiet long after visitors leave. The mansion stands calm, immaculate, neutral. But its calm is not victory. It is closure, the kind that only arrives once something has lost the ability to influence outcomes. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. Power rarely dies in battle. It survives by abandoning its monuments, which leads to the final reckoning. If power always outgrows its greatest symbol, what does that make those symbols in the end? The mansion remained, but power had already moved on, leaving behind something heavier than abandonment. In the end, the house did exactly what it was built to do. It endured. Stone held. Walls stood. Gardens remained disciplined. Time respected the craftsmanship. But endurance was never the real test. Meaning was. And meaning does not survive on maintenance alone. What the mansion became was not a failure of wealth or ambition. It became evidence of a limit few wanted to admit existed. That power when it overinvests in permanence, eventually traps itself inside yesterday's logic. The house did not decay. Its relevance did. Visitors walking through it now rarely feel threatened. They feel reflective. The scale still impresses, but it no longer intimidates. Instead, it provokes a quieter thought. This once felt necessary. That realization is far more unsettling than outrage, because it implies that the structures we defend most fiercely today may also become unnecessary tomorrow. That is the danger monuments never warn you about. They promise continuity. They deliver contrast. The mansion tells a story not through what it says, but through what it no longer does. It no longer shields. It no longer commands. It no longer absorbs public anger. It simply exists, curated, explained, contextualized, safe. Safe because it has been neutralized by time. The transformation feels peaceful, but it carries a sharp moral edge, because the house proves that power does not collapse when its symbols fade. It simply relocates. It learns. It sheds weight. It stops standing still. Those who once relied on this place to define authority no longer need it. And that is perhaps the most telling detail of all. The house did not fail its owners. The world outpaced it. The tragedy, if there is one, is not personal. It is structural. The mansion was built under the assumption that control could be stabilized, that if systems were perfected, distance engineered, and permanence guaranteed, power could escape the cycle of challenge and adaptation. But power is not a structure. It is a relationship. And relationships decay the moment one side stops responding. The house responded to nothing. It stood. It waited. It assumed that time would bend around it. Time never does. What remains now is a lesson disguised as preservation. The mansion teaches that isolation is expensive, that insulation creates blind spots, and that retreat, when mistaken for strength, accelerates obsolescence. It teaches that the cost of building above the world is eventually paid by those who inherit the height. Most importantly, it teaches that symbols age faster than systems. The family understood this before anyone said it out loud. They didn't lose power when they stopped living there. They gained flexibility. They stopped anchoring themselves to a single narrative. They learned what modern influence already knows, that survival belongs to what can move, not what can endure. The mansion could not move, so it stayed behind as proof. Proof that even the most carefully constructed fortress cannot outlive the context that justified it. Proof that power, when it tries to hide from accountability instead of renegotiating it, builds its own museum. The house still looks down from the hill, but it no longer looks ahead. And that is the quiet ending no one planned for. A structure meant to dominate the future now exists to explain the past. A place designed to protect authority now teaches its limits. The walls did not crumble. The legacy did something worse. It froze. And frozen legacies don't disappear. They linger. They remind. They whisper the same warning to every generation tempted to confuse scale with safety. Power can build anything, except permanence. The house is still there. The name is still remembered, but the price it was meant to avoid was only delayed, never erased.